Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are talking about memorization techniques for efficient bar study. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess, that's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking more about memorization since, well, you have to do it to pass the bar exam. So, Lee, why do you think memorization is such a big problem for so many people who are studying for the bar?
Well, I think the biggest issue is just the volume of the law. I mean, if you took Barbary, you probably got a book called the Convisor Mini Review. The Mini Review is like 400 pages or more. It's really
not very many.
Not very many, and that is just like a hint of how much law there is to learn. But it really is like cramming for, all of your law school exams in one fell swoop. It's a lot. And so I think the volume is a big problem. I also think that, and this is going to be an issue, I think, for students who have gone to law school virtually in the COVID days, is most exams are open book. And I think more exams are going to be open book because people are taking exams remotely. And so you may not be very well versed in memorization at all.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we didn't have any closed book exams in law school. I think I had half of my evidence exam as a final semester 3L was closed book. And we were all just like, what is this nonsense? Like, what? And literally that was it. Like everything else was open book. Yeah. I never had to memorize any law.
Mine were closed book, but I remember being a 1L and watching some of my friends in law school who had been science majors who had taken things like OChem and complicated classes which required a lot of memorization, and they had like the game down, man. They were working whatever system that they had used in college, and I was a psychology media studies major, so I did not do the same kind of huge amounts of memorization. And so it was a learning curve. So if you haven't done this in law school up to this point very often, then you need to brush up on your techniques, because here we go.
Yeah, I remember second semester Orgo. That was the one that finally killed the worst grade I've ever gotten in my life. And the reason is because we had like 4 tests. And by the second test, I decided I wasn't going to go to med school. So I just stopped studying. And like the tests were literally memorization. It was just like, can you sit down and memorize like hundreds and hundreds of these equations? And that was just not something I was interested in. So I just didn't do it. And then I barely passed. Like very, very barely passed.
Yeah.
So memorization was never like my strong suit.
Yeah.
I'm more of a big picture thinker.
Yeah. I think there are also a lot of misconceptions around the bar about how much you need to know and how accurately you need to know things. So I think that's worth unpacking a little bit.
I agree.
So the reality is you are not going to know everything perfectly. It's really not possible unless you have a photographic memory.
Right. But where I think that can lead people astray is they hear that and then they think, oh, well, I don't need to know anything perfectly. And I'm not sure that's really right either.
Oh, I agree. And I think I've become a little more focused on that fact the longer I do this work. I think there is absolutely some stuff you do need to know perfectly. You don't need to know everything perfectly, but you need to know a chunk of stuff perfectly.
Right. I mean, they're just certain things. And, people get very kind of frustrated sometimes around this or annoyed, when we push back on them. There are students and saying like, look, you need to get these words right. Oh, well, I've got the concept. It's like, you don't need the concept of summary judgment. You need to say the words. They're basically like magic words for a lot of the stuff that comes up all the time. And if you don't know cold the words that you need to say when hearsay shows up, like that's a problem. But then there are lots of other things that you need to be able to identify and kind of have a general sense of, but you don't necessarily, and it's not realistic to think that you will have like element by element, word by word knowledge of each and every single one of those things. It's just not possible.
Right. I think evidence is a great example for this, because there are just some things like you must write out, hearsay is an out of court statement offered for the truth of the matter asserted. Like you can't say anything other than that. Like that is like the rule for hearsay. It's what you memorize in law school. And that's just got to be at the tip of your tongue. And then even when you get into some of the hearsay exceptions, you need to know exactly, if it's a 3-prong test, what those 3 prongs are. And there might be terms of art in those 3 prongs. But maybe some greater concepts, you don't need to know the exact wording. But on a lot of this stuff, especially if it's codified law, you just have to know the buzzwords. And you might say, well, I don't need to know those buzzwords because it's only going to show up in an MBE question. But the MBE question tests the knowledge of those buzzwords in the answer choices.
Right, exactly.
You do have to learn, those terms of art and those buzzwords, they still are important. I think that some things that are tiny nuances that you don't need to know with as much detail, but if it's got elements to it, terms of art, or if it's something that's just really common knowledge in the legal community, then you just need to know that stuff. Right. And and I think we've been doing a lot of our Listen and Learn series on the podcast. So if you're listening, you haven't checked those out, you might find those interesting, because what we're doing is we're giving rule statements for heavily tested law on the bar exam, and then we're working through examples. And, we give you a sentence. It's like, this is the sentence.
All right, just learn it.
Just learn it. Learn it, memorize it. It's almost easier to just memorize it than it is to try and think about how best to frame the rule statement. Just memorize it.
Right. And I think for the most heavily tested part of each subject area, there are many things that you need to just be able to reel off element by element off the top of your tongue. But I mean, what do you think, what's a realistic sort of goal for people to memorize for each of these areas? I mean, like 1 page of stuff, 10 pages of stuff, like what kind of scale are we talking about? I'm assuming not 100
so hard.
Pages.
Because it's like the font size is so tiny. Like what is really one
page?
In
general.
12-point font, Times New Roman.
Yeah, 10 to 12-point font,
I think
normal
that
margins.
Right. I think that probably if you took the heavily tested stuff in each subject, you're looking at a couple pages per subject. Maybe
that's right.
A little bit longer for some of the MBE ones. So let's give yourself 2 to 3. I think you can fit the most heavily tested probably, let's say 3 pages, per subject. If you know all of that stuff, that is a very good starting point. Through practice, you will start to learn the other nuances, and you will learn more stuff on top of that. But it's just the foundation. If you have foundational knowledge of the 13 or 14 subjects, depending on how you count them, that is going to be a solid starting point for your competency. So, and I think that we don't do it that way, because we do it the drinking the fire from the fire hose way, where you're just like, I'm going to read the 400-page mini review, but we don't learn like
what
that.
What you're really talking about could end up being as short as, say, 40 pages. So 1/10 of the mini review could be what you actually try to memorize.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems doable to me.
Yeah. Right. And if you learn all of that stuff and you got extra time, good for you, memorize more stuff.
Well, and I think, let's talk about some of the best ways to memorize, because one of the very, very best ways to memorize this stuff is actually to use it. So you write a practice exam, you do MBE questions, you maybe rewrite what you get wrong if you get the wrong rule or the wrong element in your practice exam, or if you miss the MBE question because you don't know the law, you write that law down and study it.
Yeah. And I think that this is where precision comes out. We've been talking about precision a lot on our team, how precise do you need to be when you memorize, what exact language do you need to use? What are the exact terms of art you need to use? And what I'm really coming around to this idea is just be precise. Just memorize it precisely.
Right. Get it right.
Don't Yeah, like don't attempt to get the gist of something. Just memorize it. Because I think we spend a lot of time saying, well, I generally know that, or I could recognize it if I see it on an MBE question. Like it's not really worth your time. Just learn it the one way and learn it simply and cleanly, and just make it clean. I mean, I think that we sometimes like make it so complicated and we're like, well, how can I make this rule statement sound as hoity-toity or smart as I could be? The bar examiners don't care. They just want it to be clean and short. Right, make it simple, and I know that you and I have both studied different languages, and it's like you don't study super complicated phrasing when you're trying to memorize new words. You don't try and sound super eloquent when you're just trying to get nitty-gritty stuff done. You are speaking in a dry, very direct way. I think you can do the exact same thing on the bar exam.
Right. I mean, the goal is to communicate. So I think, short sentences, precise, like pithy. I mean, it's interesting. We've been, working on some memorization stuff for our students. And sometimes I look at these rules and I'm like, wow, this one's really complicated. Like it's one sentence, it's 5 lines long. Like, is there a way that we can make this easier? Like it has semicolons, like if I see a semicolon, I know I'm not writing that rule down that way.
Yeah.
Like I'm going to take that semicolon out probably and make it a period because that's going to be easier for me to remember.
Right. Or make it a list,
or something.
Whatever you can do.
I start getting worried when I see semicolons.
I think that's fair.
Like there's probably a simpler way to like write this down and remember it and be able to reproduce it accurately.
Yep.
Because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for accuracy. We're not looking for like lofty language. It should just be very simple.
The other thing that I think goes back to this idea of precision is I know a lot of times people will study off of multiple different outlines. So we've already talked about our mini review books. I know. Then somebody might have Smart Bar Prep, which we love, and then maybe somebody else has something else. I mean, there are tons and tons of outlines floating around there.
Or somebody has like the critical pass flashcards, and then they have like one they've made. So you've got like 4 different versions of the same rules, which is not a great idea.
No, because then you are also back to really feeling like you know the gist of them. And I think you're much better off. Any of these resources have language that will totally allow you to pass the bar. Like totally allow you.
They're fine. Just pick one.
They're fine. You just need to pick one. And then repetition. We've been talking a lot on our team about the importance of spaced repetition and how that helps you memorize. And it only really works if you do this, repeat the same stuff over and over again. If you're constantly introducing new things, it's not going to really work. So I guess I jumped the gun because maybe I should talk about why we like spaced repetition. And do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, spaced repetition is just this idea that to get things really into your long-term memory, you need to see them at a point at which you're about to forget them from your short-term memory. So, if you're studying for the bar and you're looking at sort of, a study period of, say, I mean, normally speaking, normal times would be like 8 to 10 weeks. You don't want to do 1 week on one topic and then move on to 1 week on another topic. And then at the very last minute, you go back and take a practice test. Like that's not the most effective way to study. You need to be mixing this up. So maybe you spend a couple of days on a topic and then, a week or a week and a half later, you spend another half day on it. These kind of things, so that you're constantly kind of checking in on that knowledge. I mean, you mentioned languages and I haven't been in a Spanish speaking country for a while. So like my Spanish is starting to like kind of flee my head, even though I still talk to my tutor occasionally. And so I was listening to a song this morning and I heard a word and I was like, oh, I used to know what that word meant. Like, what is that? Does it mean this or does it mean that? And I sat and thought of it and I actually looked it up. And so now it's like back in my head. I'm like, oh, I know that. And I know how to spell it because I was misspelling it. But it's that idea of like, now it's back in my brain for like another longer period of time because I was about to forget it. Right.
Recall is super powerful when we start to try and get information into our brains in a way that we can utilize it. And so, if you've ever used one of the new, now we're all learning languages on apps or whatever. And so if you've ever used, I'm like, I have it on my phone. The one that everybody uses.
Duolingo.
Thank you. But they are really into spaced repetition and you see the same thing, in different ways and over and over and over again, but you will see they also don't change up the phrasing very much because they are also trying to give you, one way to say one thing. because it's more important to for you to be able to say it one way than to say it 5 ways. So if you have 2 to 3 outlines for every subject, you're trying to learn 3 times the law, and that's just a terrible idea. So just pick one and be smart about how you study. So if you want to make flashcards, I think that's fine, especially for things that you need to get the wording perfect. But you still have to, I think, force yourself to not just do the flashcard and say, oh, I got the gist of it. Because I think that happens a lot. It's like doing a flashcard and making yourself write out the rule to be very honest about what the rule is. I think that has a lot of value. But to just be like, diversity, 75,000 or 80,000. It's one of those. Then you flip it over. You're like, oh, I was wrong. And then it goes in the pile. So I feel like you're just kind of but I'm good. So, I got one, I got the gist. That's not what
I knew there was a number involved someplace.
Yeah.
It's cool.
It was a ballpark, they'll give me credit for the ballpark. Yeah. They will not give me credit for the ballpark.
The thing with that rule is actually, it's not, people just think it's, complete diversity of citizenship and over $75,000. It's actually another element in there that people forget. And that's an element that's tested. And that's that it's pled in good faith to be over blah, blah, blah. So if you just kind of have that just knowledge, you might actually miss part of the question because maybe they raise an issue about whether, somebody was pleading in good faith or not.
That's true. Somebody has, a scratch on their car and then they sue in federal court for $80,000.
Right. And maybe that's an issue you need to explore because maybe the car is, whatever. But these are things that actually can show up. So I think getting them actually right, and the point of it is that then you can use the law and use the facts that you've been given and recognize these issues, but you have to know it pretty precisely to recognize the correct issues.
A place that I find that flashcards can be tricky is helping you see the universe. So if I had a flashcard for diversity and then I flipped it over, so there are kind of a few different things I'd want on there. I mean, I'd want all the elements, but then, you want to highlight that there's this kind of good faith requirement. And then I also probably need to have a note about, can you aggregate claims? What happens when you have multiple parties? Can you add them all together? So each flashcard, in my opinion, to be very complete, has to have a lot of junk on it because you want to learn all this law with these little offshoots, because it's not just a 1-sentence rule necessarily. So just think about how you want to use the flashcards to get you where you need to be. So you're not just doing legal trivia, which can happen with flashcards, and just memorizing kind of one-off rules. Your flashcard probably shouldn't say what's the, the mountain controversy for diversity. And then you're like, woohoo, I got it right. It's a little more complicated than that.
Right. Well, I think it's important to remember that you have to actually know this material in order to memorize it. So you've got to be sure that you've kind of devoted enough time and energy to really learning the material in a way that you can use it. For me, I think the only reason I would ever use flashcards are for things that I literally just need to sit down and memorize.
Yeah.
I wouldn't think of them in any other way. I don't think they're helpful at all in any other way. But I think they are helpful for literally just repetition of rules. But I think there are other things that are probably, frankly, more effective.
Yeah. And we're going to get to those. Yeah. So if you love your flashcards, don't abandon them. Just make sure they're going to work for this specific test.
Right. And don't spend so much time and energy making them. You can always buy them if you're just going to be flipping them over anyway.
So true. I'm a big fan of writing rules out repeatedly. I think that's one way that I've always found is a good way to memorize things that I'm struggling with. That just the muscle memory, visualizing it, it's always worked for me, but it has to be handwritten out. It's not necessarily typing it out. We also know that handwriting has different relationships in your brain about how you retain information than typing, which is why you can send emails or texts and not remember that you did them a different way. Right. I think that's another thing you can do. The thing we're really trying to explore a lot on our team is this idea of quizzing yourself and using, we were just talking about spaced repetition, but also just using this idea of making mistakes and learning from your mistakes. We know helps you retain information in a different way. So as much as it might make you feel crummy, you can give yourself a test on your rules at the beginning of a study session and at the end of a study session every week in review. These might be humbling experiences, but testing yourself and reviewing and retesting yourself, it ends up working. It's not fun, but it really works and is a good use of your time.
Right. I think anytime your brain has that moment of surprise when you miss something, there's really, really good studies, lots of studies showing like that's where the learning happens, because you think you know something and then you find out you don't, and your brain kind of says, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean I left a word out there? And that's when you start really processing it in a way that you're learning something. So, it's never pleasant to get something wrong, but know that you're actually making more progress when you do than if you just sit down and you're like, yep, got it. Okay, done.
Also, it's probably good to think of it in an evolutionary way. I mean, of course, our brains are going to retain our mistakes more than we're going to retain our successes, because
right. I mean, if you stick your hand on the stove and you don't want to do that again,
right?
Yeah. Like, oh, ow, that hurt. Oh, don't do that.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't, we forget some things that are unpleasant, like childbirth. So we have more children, but a lot of times we remember what is unpleasant because we don't want to repeat the same mistake twice. So it's a great way to, push yourself. Another thing you can do is even use colors. I know that this is a big one for you. You love colors and all your multiple colored markers.
Well, because I'm like I'm like a more visual learner. Right. So for me, if I have to remember, say, two versions of a single rule, so something like UCC versus the common law rule, or modern versus traditional, or in California, a big one is like state versus federal. So if I have something like that, which is super easy to confuse, it's like really hard to remember, like, and oftentimes these rules are pretty similar. They're both justifiable. So like, how do you remember which one is the California rule and which one is the federal rule for like the rules of evidence or professional responsibility or something like that? I think one of the best ways to do it is to have a visual where, say, all of the California rules are always in red and the federal ones are always in black. And so then when you're thinking in your brain and trying to recall those rules when you need to use them, I will often literally see them and I'm like, oh, that's the red one. Okay, that's California. So it's kind of activating like a different way of processing this information versus just like, how do you distinguish between these two, essentially indistinguishable rules and keep them straight? Yeah.
I have seen colors work really well with people when it comes to jurisdiction distinctions, and you mentioned in, the California rules, like studying evidence in California, you have certain rules that have these just very tiny nuances. And I've seen a lot of students really find that tracking that stuff in color just helps, because you're trying to figure out where those distinctions exist and use every part of your brain to possibly track that.
Right. Yeah. And I think anything like that where you always are just consistent about it. I mean, sometimes people like mix up their colors like from one day to the next. I'm just like, what are you doing? Like, that is not the purpose here. Like, you have to be consistent. It always has to be red if it's California.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that seems just unfathomable to me, but that's just the way my brain works.
Hey, if it works, it doesn't really matter why it works. It just works. That's why we're talking about options,
Right. Yeah. And I think another visual idea is, the sort of memory palace idea. So if you're very spatial and sort of three-dimensional, you can also envision, imagine a room where you're walking through the room and like different objects might relate to a certain piece of, a test or something, or like maybe the relationship between things. And you can even, sometimes you can find like little scenes basically of various online stuff where they're actually like acting out different scenes. So there are lots of different things you can do. I mean, that's how, Ulysses was, well, I guess Ulysses wasn't the one memorizing it, but the bards of old who were telling the story of like Ulysses, like this is how they did it. I mean, they had to be basically, they had to remember all this stuff, and it's like hundreds of thousands of words basically.
Yeah. I mean, memorization is not new. We used to have to memorize everything. I don't even memorize most people's phone numbers anymore.
Well, I think I know two.
Yeah. And
mine and my mother's, which is where we grew up.
And I know half of yours because yours has the same first 6 digits as my husband's, which is super weird. Super weird that happened.
I actually forgot like my mother's address the other day, which is where I grew up. I was like, what in the world is her address? I think that just shows how stressed out we all are, because that like is really in my brain somewhere. It took me a second. I was like, wait, it starts with a number. What is the number? And then I remembered it. But it was definitely not in the front of my brain.
Yeah. Well, let's be honest. Stress does not help retention.
No, definitely not.
Yeah, so I think that the big thing that I really want people to take from this podcast is that there are so many different ways to memorize. There's a lot of science on this. Trying out some of these techniques is really one of the things that you want to do. As long as I don't really care how you memorize, as long as you can get to the point where you can give me a specific rule statement. So if I say, give me the prongs for dying declaration, you can just rattle them off to me. That is where you need to be. If you do that by using mnemonics or short attack plans or memory palaces or by flashcards, I don't really care. But you just have to make sure that you get to the end result. And you should try some of these different techniques if you especially haven't done a lot of memorization to help you get to that goal.
Right. And I think oftentimes you can too think about combining them. So if I'm thinking, for example, about I need to remember at a basic level, I need to be able to write down all the different hearsay exceptions. Maybe I make a mnemonic for that. I mean, I'm sure there are mnemonics out there for that because you're not the first person to ever do this. So maybe there's a mnemonic that helps you get whatever, I don't even know what it is, 12, 18. I mean, it's a lot. Right. And then within those, maybe you prioritize like, okay, these are like the 5 that show up over and over that I'm going to memorize word for word. And you have flashcards on those. And then you do practice questions with those. And so then hopefully, you've got your flashcards, you've memorized them word for word, you're doing your best on that. And then when you do the practice question, you get one of them wrong. And then that's going to stick in your brain. So we're not necessarily trying to memorize every piece of law in that level of detail, but you can be strategic about the ones that tend to show up over and over.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, you can actually learn a huge amount of information, but you've got to figure out what works with your brain and don't waste time. There's not a time, just don't waste time.
Well, and speaking of time, I mean, I think one problem we see a lot with memorization is people tend to try to leave it to the end. And so maybe you have a study schedule that you've gotten from somewhere that says like last 2 weeks, memorize. That is way too late.
Way too late.
That is not going to happen.
No, it's such a recipe for disaster. And then you end up just, memorizing and not practicing. So you're just thinking that you're memorizing without like moving it into your long-term memory, doing any active learning. There's just no way that is the best way to study. I'm sorry to the bar providers that focus on that. I'm not actually. I think it's a huge waste of time.
They're making a mistake. Don't listen.
They're making a huge mistake. Most people need to be studying and memorizing throughout the prep period so you can see it multiple times, and this idea of spaced repetition will work. The more times you see things, the more it's going to stick in your head. It's just, there's science behind it. This is how it works.
Right. And like, I promise you will get better. We've been making quizzes and moving them online lately, and every single, I made the quiz, and then when I take it, I get stuff wrong. And then I, take it again and I still get stuff wrong, but I get less wrong. Right. And then I take it again a few days later and I get different stuff wrong, but I get more stuff right. You will get better if you make yourself do this over and over again. That's just how your brain works.
Yeah. But you have to be willing to stumble and have little tiny failures and be honest with yourself what you don't know, because it is a journey, but you will be collecting more and more knowledge as you go. But it's not like a light switch. Like unless you have a photographic memory, you just don't like read the outline and it's in your brain. So
no, and also, just reading it is often not enough. You've got to really interact with the material, even if you try to say cover up certain words and just quiz yourself that way, but that act of like quizzing yourself and making yourself like realize what you really do and don't remember, or like what you did with writing out the rules. Like, it's just like you can imagine Bart Simpson, like writing those rules over and over. And if you look at, if you write the rule 5 times and then you compare it to your actual rule and realize you had a word wrong, you're probably not going to get it wrong next time.
Yep, it's so true. So you got to be realistic and, memorize what's actually memorizable. You need to memorize what's heavily tested. But you can cover a lot of ground if you're strategic about this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think this is not hopeless, even if you're not someone who's like naturally that great at memorizing, because a lot of this is frankly a skill and their techniques. And so just to say like, oh, I'm not good at memorizing is not helpful. Yeah. This is time for a growth mindset. Like figure out what's going to help you get better. And maybe you're not like, the absolute best person on the bar exam, but you don't have to be. You just have to be like good enough.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I think with that, we're about out of time. Any final thoughts?
I would just say don't give up, and I think struggle with the stuff that makes you uncomfortable. And that is ultimately how you will learn enough of this that hopefully you can pass.
Yeah. And I think using your example of not being able to remember your mom's address, I think that if you're listening to this and we're still in the COVID times, it is really important to, realize that we are under stress. Our brains are probably not functioning at their best, and to give yourself intermittent breaks, give yourself the opportunity to, refresh, take walks, meditate, do yoga, do whatever you do, but be kind to yourself. Don't just think that you can sit down and memorize for 8 hours a day. I mean, that's not going to be practical, even in the best of circumstances, but also meet yourself where you are and do the best with what you can.
Well, and I'd rather have someone commit to spending even 30 minutes a day or 60 minutes a day consistently to try to memorize a few things. That's ultimately going to be so much more productive than trying to cram an 8-hour day for 2 weeks straight at the very end.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right. Well, with that, I think we're out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. I'm sure everyone wants to take all our quizzes now that we've been talking about.
Ooh, they're so fun.
They're so fun. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you're still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or Alison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via the website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.